case, officer. Take it over, creep.
Robocop was one of those films that I saw as a kid at an age where I probably shouldn't have been watching movies like that. I'm not trying to act like films are harmful, but when you're 8 years old, watching a cop get blown to pieces by a bunch of thugs with shotguns isn't really conducive to a restful night's sleep.
Thank you for your cooperation. Good night.
But as the years went on and I hardened up, I came to love Robocop. Well, the first film anyway, and even all these years later, there's just something so timeless about the character.
Stay out of trouble.
When I was young, I was also lucky enough to own Robocop vs Terminator on the Sega Genesis, a game we picked up from cash converters at the time, which I sunk some serious hours into. But outside of that, Robocop didn't really make that much of a splash in the gaming industry, and most of the games based off the films weren't all that good. Case in point is the Robocop FPS game, aptly named Robocop, which was developed by Titus in 2003, the last game they made before disbanding. Now this game is a little bit hard to find information for. As far as I could tell, there was a version of the game developed for GameCube, PS2 and the Xbox with a half-assed port released for the PC as well, which is obviously what I'm playing. A lot of critics at the time gave it pretty low scores and no one I knew even played it, so if you were expecting it to be some kind of triumphant swan song for Titus, well then you're going to be a little bit disappointed, because the game's terrible.
It's the thought that counts.
I know what you're thinking, a first-person shooter game where you get to play as Robocop. I'd buy that for $1, right? How can they possibly screw it up? Well, they managed to.
You can arrest me, but I ain't talking.
Obviously, as I mentioned, the game's a first-person shooter where you expectedly play as Robocop in Neo Detroit sometime in the near future. Story elements are delivered through commercials at the start of each mission, similar to how it's handled in the films, with those very tongue-in-cheek advertisements and newsreels. Shortly into the game, there's the appearance of a new and deadly drug hitting the streets called Brain Drain, which is a bit of a rip-off of the drug Nuke from the second film, and the campaign then focuses around Robocop taking on a series of missions as he tackles the rising crime rate in the city, and the increase of Brain Drain hitting the streets. Each mission has a bunch of primary and secondary objectives you have to complete, with secondary objectives being optional to increase your end-of-level score. These might include rescuing hostages or arresting a certain amount of criminals. During the briefing screen, you can even look through pages and pages of intel, letting you know what type of enemies you're up against and what to look out for during the missions. And yeah, look, it sounds good in theory, but it won't take all that long playing before you see how the whole thing just doesn't quite work.
I'm having trouble.
To be honest, they were kind of screwed from the get-go. I mean, Robocop doesn't quite work as a first-person shooter for a whole heap of reasons. For starters, Robocop isn't a Navy SEAL or a Space Marine. He's barely human and basically a huge suit of bulletproof armor, little more than a walking tank. He can't really jump, he can't really run, he's just not all that mobile in general, and about all he's good at is walking slowly through a room of bad guys and systematically taking them all out. Go and watch all the action scenes from the films and you'll see what I mean. In the first film, when he's in the drug factory, for instance, a couple dozen guys are shooting at him to no avail. Even in the new movie too, there's a whole action scene where he's getting shot at by about 20 guys and has to just keep firing back until they're all dead. When people are shooting at him, he never really seems to try to avoid taking damage, and look, that's fair enough, that's who he is as a character. I'm not saying it isn't cool, don't get me wrong, it's cool as all hell.
Ladies, stay down.
But the dilemma here presents itself when trying to apply that character to a video game. The goal of a video game, particularly in FPS, is to not get hit by enemies, yet you're playing as a character to whom that very notion has no real bearing. How does this equate into the game itself? Well, as you'd expect. You pretty much do what Robocop would do in that situation, doing little more than just walking through a room, shooting at bad guys over and over. Because they're all hit-scanning enemies, you can't really avoid taking damage, so you just have to try to kill them as fast as possible and hope you've got enough shield and energy to take the beating. And just like the films, most small arms fire is little more than a nuisance than a real threat. To balance this out, they've added in enemies that use energy weapons that are quite able to literally kill you in 1 or 2 hits, even on the normal difficulty. What you end up with is this polarizing difficulty where you're facing dozens of human enemies who offer up absolutely no challenge, or a single tough enemy that has the capabilities to kill you within seconds. Trying to work in the police officer aspect of Robocop into the game isn't the worst idea either, and in fact, it's probably one of the better implemented mechanics in the game. How this works is that as you're moving through the levels, you're coming across criminals and civilians. The goal is always to rescue as many civilians as possible in between killing or arresting the criminals. Rescuing a civilian or hostage is as easy as walking up to them and pressing the interact button, but arresting criminals seems to be down to chance. The idea here is that you can shoot the weapon out of their hand and they'll surrender, yet sometimes shooting them directly in the hand will accidentally kill them. And other enemy types, like those armed with larger weapons, simply won't drop their weapons at all. If someone surrendered and you shoot them, you're disobeying one of Robocop's prime directives and you lose a bit of health and get a worse off end level score, but like I said, this seems to be at random as to whether or not an enemy is going to surrender in the first place.
Your move, creep.
If you could actually make the choice to incapacitate enemies instead of relying on an invisible number cruncher to do the job for you, it might make this mechanic a little bit more interesting, but as it is, it just seems superfluous. In terms of things to shoot bad guys with, surprisingly, Robocop doesn't really disappoint. You've got his iconic Auto 9 pistol, which in-game has the most stock sound effect you've ever heard, but it at least looks faithful to the films and fires in a 3-round burst, so they've nailed it in that aspect. Outside of that, there's a few other weapons as well. There's the machine gun and rocket launcher attachment for Robocop's arm, which I think is supposed to be a reference to the third film. There's also a grenade launcher and something called an ion gun, which looks like a Star Trek phaser. I think Robocop suffers mostly from the fact that it's just a shitty PC port for a shitty console game. It's quite clear playing it that it was designed with consoles first and the PC secondly. Navigating the menus in particular feels like you should be using a controller. There's no quick saves or even checkpoints, and if you're killed during a mission, you have to go right back to the start. Some missions are split up between 3 or 4 separate maps, and it's just weird that they don't let you start from the current map during these moments. You can only save in between missions as well, kind of reinforcing that console mentality towards saving. Another thing is how the game looks visually. I mean, just look at it. It came out in 2003 and it looks like shit. At this point, we had games like Soldier of Fortune 2, Jedi Outcast, and No One Lives Forever 2, and even on the PlayStation 2, there were games like Metal Gear Solid 2, Devil May Cry, and Silent Hill 2 that looked much better. Having said that though, I was kind of surprised at how well the game ran on my computer, seeing as this was kind of the dead zone for games, where a lot of games from around the same time period are impossible to get running on modern hardware. It obviously doesn't support 4K resolutions or anything stupid like that, but it does run at a solid frame rate, and I don't think I had a single game crash the entire time, so if nothing else, it's got that going for it. But hands down, my biggest issue is that it lacks Peter Weller doing Robocop's voice, and it lacks anything even remotely similar to the music composed by Basil Polidorus or even Leonard Rosenman. And those are some of the things that made the Robocop films so iconic.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
The guy doing Robocop's voice in the game repeats a few lines from the films, but it's the same 5 or 6 lines over and over, and it loses its luster really quickly.
You are under arrest.
You can see that the people who made the game are fans to some extent of the films. The plot takes elements from the first and second films, and you even take on a few Ed 209 units throughout the game as kind of mini boss fights. But it can't help the whole thing from feeling like such wasted potential, and you can see why no one ever really talks about this game or even knows about it.
Oh, yeah.
Robocop isn't a particularly long game. I think all up I probably spent maybe 5 or 6 hours on the whole thing. And once it's finished, all you get for your trouble is the ability to replay any mission from the main menu, and that's about as groundbreaking as a hot dinner. Give me an open world Robocop game where I can drive around Detroit, shooting creeps in convenience stores late at night and stalking my ex-wife while she goes out to collect the mail. Now I'd buy that for $1.
Congratulations, Robocop. Your mission was a success.